Hello, everyone. I'm John Lynn, the founder and chief editor at Healthcare IT Today. Excited to bring you another in our series of interviews. And today we'll be talking about telehealth, the topic of 2020. And my guest today is John Kalix. He's CEO at SOC Telemed. Welcome, John.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah, so I'm excited to learn more about what you do. So for those not familiar with you or SOC Telemed, tell us a little bit about yourself and the company.
Absolutely. A little bit about myself first. I've been in healthcare for 25 years. I started way back with Johnson & Johnson for more than a decade, worked my way through pharmaceutical and the small device industries, worked with companies like Cardinal Health on both not only the supply chain issues that healthcare deals with, but the technology at the bedside. I worked for a number of years at GE Healthcare and a number of the North American businesses. And most recently, before I came to SOC Telemed, I worked for a large physician group. And I brought those experiences together from the technology background of working through hospitals and trying to think through integrations with the background that I've had working with our physicians prior to coming to SOC, the SOC Telemed here recently this summer as we were going from a private company to a public company in the marketplace. SOC Telemed at its core, it really plays in the acute care hospital telemedicine space. Very different from the direct-to-consumer sort of bumps and bruises, that type of area where you're connecting maybe a primary care physician or a specialty physician or care you can be doing at home. What we really provide is bringing specialists to the hospital for really time-intensive, high acuity, really serious issues within the hospital, whether it be in neurology or psychiatry or the ICU, where we actually bring our own specialists to help with the hospital because it's obviously very hard for hospitals, whether you're in a big city or a rural area, to staff, and maybe it's staffing 24/7, maybe it's staffing on the few odds hours, maybe it's staffing for a peak. Or we also help more recently as COVID has really created a whole new environment. We base our physicians on a technology backbone called Telemed IQ, and we use that for all of our own clinicians, but also we are working with other physician groups and hospitals with that technology to maximize and fractionalize their own clinicians, where they might have a pool of individuals who are available and a site that is looking for those specialists. And we use the Telemed IQ platform. And then behind all that, we have what we call our customer consult center. It's really the command and control center to make sure when you're talking about this high acuity care that you have layers of protection because minutes matter when we're playing. And that's the space that SOC Telemed plays in from as you think about telemedicine.
Yeah, I love that description. And it's always annoyed me when said telehealth exploded, right? I'm like, telehealth means a lot of things to a lot of different people. I mean, even people like remote patient monitoring were saying they were telemedicine, which they might have a telehealth component, but that hasn't exploded the same way, right? Live video telehealth definitely exploded, but did live video, specialty telehealth is different than maybe just your run-of-the-mill scrapes or bruises. So, I love that you differentiated that way because a lot of people don't understand that. But, before we dive into that, what really makes SOC different from, say, other telehealth providers? What do you need to really provide that specialty telehealth?
If you think about, again, how most people imagine telehealth when you think about physicians, again, with a patient, it can be as simple as a Zoom-like kind of activity in an interface where you don't have to be exchanging a lot of patient information as you think through. I'll give you a best analogy. If you think about a patient, you're sitting at home, you have a stroke, or you think you might be having a stroke. You get put into that ambulance and you're rushed to a hospital. You're immediately rushed back to the CT to have an image taken so you can see what's happening inside the brain to understand what's the course of action needed to take place. Every minute matters. So every minute you're losing 2 million neurons every single minute. So you can't wait 15, 20, 30, 40 minutes for a neurologist to be there. Every minute matters to you on how you're going to come out of that stroke, what's the right treatment you're doing. So that patient's rushed back from the CT back to the emergency room. What we were trying to do with the technology or Telemed IQ platform is we're pulling in the CT exam, we're pulling in the labs exam, we're pulling up the diagnostics from what we heard from the local staff. We're giving that information to the physician that is ready and queued. And again, what we really work on is making sure the physician is ready 24/7, 365 within minutes. So unlike if you had a direct-to-consumer visit right? And you could sit there and say, I have a cough or a cold, I'm going to schedule something for 2 o'clock. No one knows at any hospital in the country, if you're coming in at 2:10 a.m. or if you have 10 people coming in at noon on a Saturday with a stroke or with another neurological issue. So you have to have not just one physician, but multiple physicians. You have to be using analytics to think through the scope. And in the hospital space, to practice medicine in a hospital, a physician has to be not only licensed in the state, which obviously has changed during the COVID and the national emergency, but you have to be privileged and credentialed at that hospital. That could take usually 2 to 3 months. So if a hospital is in need of a neurologist or a psychiatrist or intensivist, and the ability to pull in individuals that are essentially a member of their medical staff, which we work with the hospital on all those dynamics, and then making sure as the patient's coming in, we're connecting the right physician with the right specialty to the right patient. So coming in, let's say with a psychiatric episode, you might need a child psychiatrist, or you might need somebody that has a very specific specialty within that. And we use data and analytics for what we're seeing coming ahead, going the right physician at the right time to the right patient with the right specialty. It also helps then our physicians practice at the top of their license. We're bringing our best specialized physician to that patient. And if you think about the volume of difficult patients we see then, because we're constantly in the emergency rooms or in the inpatient setting, healthcare is no different than any kind of sport. The more you practice, the better you are. The more you see these really difficult cases, the better your clinical care is going to be. So the fact that our physicians can see a lot of these really difficult cases, or many times you might see one spectacular case once a month if you worked in one hospital, our physicians through the Telemed Acute platform getting centralized to specialty cases can see something once a week. And therefore clinical care goes up because we can bring, again, the right experience with the right technologies within minutes in front of that patient, helping that medical staff at the site.
So John, I'm just not sure why you think FaceTime doesn't integrate with the CT image, and that wouldn't be good enough. I'm just kidding. No, I mean, I think that's the comparison that people miss, right, when it comes to specialty care. And, you know, what are those features that really make what you're doing special? I mean, you talked about the integration with CT. I mean, that's a powerful idea, right? And being able to have all of the patient's information together with a video, which, you know, everyone can do video, but what are the other features that are needed? And is it also, it sounds like, is there an element of having the connection to the right doctors? Is that part of it too? And coverage pieces as well? I mean, is that what makes the specialty, you know, telehealth specific solution that you're offering different and unique? Or what are the nuances and features that are really needed beyond just, okay, I can live stream a video?
So there are so many elements that make acute care telemedicine very specific and much more complex. There's this giant sort of moat of complexity that takes place. First of all, you step back within every single hospital, and in fact, every floor within a hospital, they have their unique workflow. I think every IT company has figured out that if you try to force your process on the nursing staff or the physician staff versus the other way around, you just create so much frictional change. You actually will either hurt patient care, something will not get utilized, or both, right? And so what ends up happening is you have to run through many, many algorithms of what does each and every department need. You have to be thinking through those processes, and then you have to put those processes into an algorithm that you know, and you can interview the staff way ahead of time to understand how they work. Make sure many workflows are situated. So when I mentioned that CT exam with the neurostroke patient, you can imagine how many people have to be in that dance, all thought ahead of time, and then all put in through a model that makes sure we know someone at the hospital knows how they're reaching out to us. We know how to get the information through the hospital. We can understand what's happening as fast as what's happening with that patient as they're walking in the door. If they're in the ICU, we're looking for key measures that will drive clinical quality that we've agreed and sat with the hospital. What's your important clinical measures that you're trying to drive either at the single hospital or maybe at a system level? And that complexity that you navigate with department by department, function by function, has been thought through the system. And so a lot of things get automated in that regard. We have more than 1.2 million patients that have gone through the Telemed Acute platform. That's a lot of skin, knees, and bumps and bruises on our own, learning through what you have to ask, and then you have to develop from a coding standpoint to really make that whole interface feel simple. But what feels simple is not simple, especially under time and pressure. It'd be different, again, if you could have a meeting or schedule a meeting, and we do rounding, we do pre-set up established appointments. That is something that is much more fluid as a process piece. But when you might be rounding and that same physician is getting called into a critical care piece, but they don't want to interrupt that patient interaction like we're having here live on video, the ability to be able to cue in another physician and cover that so the patient to physician interaction goes uninterrupted, that does a lot of things. One, the patient feels like they're having a better experience, so they tell the hospital they had a good experience. To the patient, they don't know if that person is an employee of the hospital or not. They just want to feel they've been looked at uninterrupted, and that they have a good quality appointment, whether it be, obviously you don't know what's happening during a stroke, but if you're having a follow-up neurological appointment, maybe in the inpatient unit. So all those little technicalities have to be thought through, and we turn those lessons into programming underneath. And then every interaction has, if you think about elements and data, every patient consult, every patient visit we have has an amazing amount of information because it all runs through Telemed Acute. So whether it's our own physicians or the hospital's physicians or someone else's physicians from a physician group, we're measuring time units, we're measuring time to door, time to needle, we're measuring all these pieces for quality. And being able to share that to a hospital saying, if we look at a hospital the same size and scale of you, here's where you benchmark at. And so being able to share all of the hospital's data to each other in a blinded fashion to say, where can we think about process, and then be process engineering where technology can't meet in the middle. And as well, we can use a customer consult center to measure for those process errors. That's the continuation of healthcare that you're really trying to drive. We have a lot of individuals on the team that are Six Sigma. I'm a Six Sigma black belt myself. And the point on constantly improving, I think that's what hospitals are really looking for in a partnership. A lot of hospitals have thought through process and Six Sigma many years ago, but healthcare is complex. And once you nail a process, the ball moves and you got to rethink to another one. And COVID has certainly done that to everybody.
Yeah. No, it's interesting how much it all goes back to the workflow. And, it is the area of telehealth that I'm most interested to see evolve, whether it's on the, regular visit side or the acute specialty side, that workflow matters so much, and EHR's failed. Anyway, that's a topic for another day, in that regard, in many cases. Interesting. I just did an interview with a CIO who's also an MD, which, it provides a unique perspective. And I said, what would you like as an MD to share with your CIOs that aren't MDs? And he said, it's pain. He said, the pain of dealing with technology when you have a patient on the bed that is suffering from some condition and you're trying to treat it and you're having to deal with the pain of technology. So I think you described well why this is needed and why, the work you've done is so important. So I appreciate you sharing that. Let's talk about carts. Telehealth used to, I think many people said telehealth and thought telehealth cart, and there's probably some good historical reason for that, but from your perspective, where are we at on the telehealth cart? Where does it make sense to have a telehealth cart, and where does it not really needed? Is it not really needed? Is it fine to just use a consumer device or tablet or whatever it might be?
It's a great question, and we actually thought about that question years ago, even before I got to SOC Telemed. So one of the things that SOC focused on years ago was we were going to be cart agnostic. So whether we use someone else's cart that a hospital's already purchased, whether we sell a cart because the hospital's in need of a cart, basically we said we have to be hardware agnostic, because you think about some of the carts nowadays and you can think forward as people are getting more used to this technology. And it's the same thing as when you had the big TV hutch in your house to hold the TV that was 50 inches deep as much as 40 inches wide.
Yep.
There's a lot of times now, as you think about mobility, that's just not necessary. So carts actually do help in some regards, and creating the interface between the nurse and the physician on the hospital floor with the patient there, back to one of our physicians, let's say, wherever they're practicing from. But there are so many areas you don't need the cart. You can work on a tablet, you can work off your phone. I think there are certain specialties you still need the cart, especially so, and I'll go back to the stroke example, right? We have to look really into the eye to understand what's happening in the eye. So you need a really high-end camera in that regard to be on the cart to make sure you're making the right diagnosis with everything that's taking place. There's all kinds of plugins and players that are coming in with the carts. But just as in the ICU space, you used to wire up every single bed in the ICU space, and that was a really hot thing to do for quite a long time. But it costs you $25,000, $30,000 per bed. And as everything is going wireless, that technology may not be necessary. You could do all of that without the wires, and as more medical devices are becoming Bluetooth enabled, et cetera, as well. The cart won't be the central point of that focus. And I think what we have to do is always think beyond the cart as something that's tethering you down. It does create a sense for who has the football, right? Who's the person that is on lead to pull the physician together with the patient, with the clinician on the floor. So in a way, it's the next step within the barrier of telemedicine. In many cases, it's as emotional a barrier as it is an actual technical barrier, right? And I think as folks get much more comfortable and tablets get more efficient and on the floor, you can see tablets laying all over the place. Half of them are not charged. But as things get smarter and people get much more attuned to how to navigate these waters, I think the cart itself will become less of a necessity until you get to the really specific use cases.
Yeah, it's amazing how much technology is the same. It reminds me of implementing an electronic medical record. And what we missed most was the chart was how you knew if the patient was ready or if the patient was ready for the nurse or for the doctor. You had to rethink those workflows. It sounds like there's a similar thing with the cart. Okay, who has the cart, is passing the football as you described. That's a great example. Speaking of the EHR, how do you approach the EHR integration? What's your take on that? And then I'll also push you because obviously I'm an EHR guy from background. That's where I started all of healthcare IT today. But where would you like to see EHR vendors improve their EHR integration? I'm always interested from someone who has to do this, right? Where are you at today, and where would you love to see some improvement?
It's been this evolution, actually. So before telemedicine was really well known within the hospital, it was almost like a security element of it's so new, let's be overly cautious. So at first it started with just a simple HL7 interface. Then now we're in sort of the FHIR interface with electronic medical records. And obviously electronic medical record companies are all going to be thinking about how they can get into the telemedicine game, right? I think the point that you always have to think through is there's so much more than just getting access to the patient information. It's again that whole workflow between departments. There's a lot of things that don't interplay well, within the electronic medical record. They're important for really high acuity, time-intensive care, like we had discussed. So, and I also think there's this point of there's just vendor burnout, right? Hospitals have to manage so many different languages between so many different systems. CIOs have to think about IT security measures all the time. That's why we jumped in with the high trust and other elements to make sure that we're providing some of that technical background as we work with hospitals. But I think as electronic medical records come into play, it's how can we enable that for more broad and fast communication within a hospital to enable other telemedicine-like strategies. Again, our core, we bring the specialists with the technology, with the workflow. All three of those pieces take a very unique amount of time and expertise to sort of navigate within acute care telemedicine. I think there are many areas where things are getting easier, but the time to navigate and work with the companies, they're pretty good about trying to really have the right specialists working with you to get integrated. It's each, as you know, you might be on an instance of Epic, and the next hospital is a different instance, is a different instance, is a different instance. And you think about if you're a physician covering 7 hospitals, maybe all on Epic, but you happen to be on telemedicine, and something is a little bit different where it is or where you have to find it. And if that slows down your time to respond when time matters, those things have to be considered, right? And so I think as we think about unwinding people tethered to one location, regardless, and the fact that they're going to work across multiple hospitals more and more often with either a health system or within their state, the ease of navigating within that electronic medical record is going to be really important, whether you're on one instance or you're crossing electronic medical records. So I think some standards could help there, really unhinge, because everyone is aware the shortage of physicians, the shortage of nurses, the shortage of just people in the clinical space. And the way to actually help with that is to fractionalize everyone's time to be able to help, where it might be really slow here today, but it's someone else down the street is getting crushed and they need help. But it's harder for me to help if I have to navigate through different screens to find where the information is, because everything's a little bit different. And all of that will create some friction until we solve for that. And I think everyone's looking up now saying geography shouldn't matter how I help patients. And I think that'll evolve. And I think the more the EHR companies, as well as we just think through that space, I think a lot of folks can do a lot of good here. I really do think the shortage of physicians, it cannot be solved through this, but being able to fractionalize people's time to be able to really help. I was in New York at the beginning of COVID, and we were getting help by people in California sending us their ventilators so we could be using them for patients in New York. This is no different. And just you're getting rid of the ventilator and the piece of equipment, and now we're saying, could you have the physicians in California be helping the physicians in New York? Or right now, it could be the physicians in New York helping the physicians in California. And we have to get outside of the concrete boundaries. Telehealth pushes that mentality. I think it also generates a lot of really unique what ifs. And I think that's why I know my whole team's excited about being in the space, because outside of what we do every day, the what ifs are just endless. And it just tells you healthcare IT is going to be a phenomenal space to be in for the next decade.
Yeah. No, those are some interesting perspectives. And I wouldn't have thought of it from the physician documentation perspective across multiple instances of an EHR, the same EHR or not. That's really interesting. I think it was your comment about the EHR vendors competing with telehealth is fascinating as well. You know, I did a whole series of interviews with EHR vendors on how they're approaching telehealth. And it's clear to me from that, so you don't even have to comment on this, that they're going to compete on the live video visit. But do you think they're going to compete on the specialty care as well? Or do you think they're going to look to partners because the workflows are so unique, because the quality of images needed, or, the extra attachment to do, the ultrasounds, or, whatever else might be needed to stream to the doctor? Do you think they're going to go in that, or do you think they'll still look to partners for most of the acute care specialty telehealth?
It's a great question. I can't really predict, obviously, where they might sort of run to. I think the market is evolving and changing so quickly. Everyone's looking at the word telehealth and then saying, where do they want to play? Where do they want to compete? How do they want to improve? And where we are now, we all know this will look very different than it will in the next 10 years. So It's hard to say where people will really play in the space of telehealth. I think more people being in it is only a good thing, because I think the element of taking away the common questions. I'll tell you the first, and I'll give you a perfect example. When I had a few first C-suite meetings, and you can imagine some hospitals had wide open buildings with plenty of space. And the first thought was, hey, could I bring some of my clinicians all to one? I have this open office space now. Could I move them all to one place and have them do the telemedicine from one location? And it's like the thought was almost there, but why can't they just stay at home and do it? Right? Why do they have to be sitting next to somebody, right? It's like, it's almost there. It's advancing the ball versus saying I have to be on the floor. And this is where, the need for more and more nurses and more is going to be more and more paramount to healthcare, because they play such a special role. And many times the sort of championing those other individuals that drive healthcare at the core aren't always recognized. And I think telehealth and other remote health can only go so far as the entire care team figures this out. And so I think there's a lot to be playing here. I don't know where people go from a direction standpoint, but I do know a muscle for how you work with specialists and how you work with physicians is very different than how you think through the coding on how to help maximize them. Those are two different angles, and usually you can only play well in one. And I think every EHR company is going to have to navigate where do they want to really play, because you can get lost in things, and the risk here is high. It's not you missed a cold. And someone ended up passing away because a mistake was made while you were trying to learn. And everyone knows the mantra of do no harm. So the hurdle is very high to really practice medicine, but also advance medicine.
Yeah, that's fascinating. The perspective of the doctors all being in one spot, and why didn't they move to the home? We actually saw that in the medical coder space where, they outsourced to India. They said you have to be at the office because of privacy and security. And then COVID hit, and now they couldn't go into the office.
Right.
Obviously medical coding is a little different than a surgeon who would have gotten exceptions, but it's just fascinating that the constraints we have and that we have to overcome. So I think it's interesting. Let's talk about COVID's impact on it. How has that impacted the acute care specialty telehealth space? I mean, obviously we've seen an explosion of patients who can't come in. Have you seen the same explosion where the surgeon wants to be remote, or has it been kind of more just, side benefit? How has it impacted the marketplace for people wanting to do this type of solution?
So in the hospital, it's actually completely inverse to what you would think from the direct-to-consumer type space for telemedicine. If you flash back all the way to March or April, and COVID was starting to become known, but still not completely known, every hospital in the country basically told people, only come to the hospital if you are in really need of care or you have COVID. And so volumes, even in our specialties, neurology, psychiatry, intensivists, they all went down. Surgeries were canceled. All of those things happened. And I think as hospitals learned how to message to their communities and encourage people to come in for the right reasons, that they started creating the right, this door's for COVID, that door's for non-COVID, and things started to separate. We saw volumes pick up from where they were. There was a very steep drop. Our volumes basically mirrored at first the same drop that you saw within the emergency room visits, period. And then ours actually picked up much faster than the emergency room volume. But there was still this lag. What we've seen now with this next round of COVID is our volumes haven't dropped. So that element on, sort of the reaction again, our volumes haven't dropped, but our volumes haven't also gone up yet. We're seeing this sort of weekly, monthly climb in the volume piece. And so there's a pre-COVID, then a post-COVID piece. At the same time, the amount of interest in telemedicine for acute care space went way up. And so I would say the individuals that we were talking to for years were either almost evangelical, in the standpoint of they knew you could advance healthcare differently, or the very early adopters. That was almost everyone sort of in the telemedicine space, except for telestroke specifically, telemedicine in the acute care space up to COVID. And now, because everyone understands that this interaction is not overly cold and that you can actually do good medicine as long as you have all the other information coming over simultaneously. And if you do that right, you can actually do even better care at certain points in time because speed matters as well as the data matters.
Right.
That's what can drive the piece. So we saw the interest really peak up after the COVID sort of what just happened to us took place. And now we're being asked about a number of different specialties outside the ones we're in, as well as parts of the country and systems that had not a year and a half ago would not consider it, all of a sudden understand that. And I think some of that is just human change. I know I have family members who are in medical profession, nurses, et cetera, within my own family. They would have never have gone on to a telemedicine visit before, and they were all at home in COVID doing it. Now they went back to the hospital, and it's not unusual for them. It just became what we do. And so it really was a before and after event with COVID, but the initial reaction was everyone stay home. So those emergency patients, if you had a stroke, you were still coming to the hospital. But if you were at home because you had a really bad nerve pinch, you might just suffer it out and wait. Right.
Definitely.
And that was the difference that dropped some of the volumes off. Some cases are going to come to the hospital. There was all kinds of reports of people not coming to the hospital with those severe, and passing away at home instead. I think now that people are understand COVID, and especially now that as the vaccine rolls out, I think individuals understand what this can be, and we've been getting ready for that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think these healthcare organizations have been hit. You described it well, that fall off that happened with all the elective procedures. what's telehealth's role to play in their recovery, and any thoughts on what's going to happen with telehealth reimbursement? Is we saw the peak, we saw a lot of people just hop on board. Is it going to fall off? Do we have the data now to prove that, hey, this is good and we're going to continue? Any thoughts on where reimbursement's going to go, and what role that's going to play in healthcare organizations survival in some cases, right? And or thrival for the larger ones, maybe.
I think we might see, a bimodal dip as you think about direct-to-consumer type telemedicine. Obviously there's been some of that, but there's going to be this natural reaction as well as you have now a younger generation completely experiencing this as potentially their first visit to physicians, right? I think that's going to have a long-term implication for how telemedicine is utilized. And those same individuals who are going to be going into medical school or in medical school right now, right, will influence sort of the next wave of technological innovation. So I don't see that ebbing up. I think what we look at it as, even ourselves this year, where COVID was an interesting down few months, long term, it just set a huge trajectory for growth if you look at the long game versus the very short game. And I think that's no different than when you think about telemedicine overall. I think also the phrase on the reimbursement side is, once the cat's out of the bag, it's hard to get back in. And I don't see that necessarily changing. Obviously, new things are coming out nearly weekly now about how reimbursement is changing. It's interesting in our space, our interaction working with hospitals up till January 2019 was a B2B interaction. We had a contract with a hospital and we would talk telemedicine services for specialty care. In January 2019, the very first reimbursable hospital element, which was telestroke, became reimbursable, but nothing else. And then during the national emergency, things kept playing in, and now you have to make a decision. Do you think it's going to stay or is it going to go? But there hasn't been a lot of reimbursed monies flowing into the hospital acute care space for telemedicine. We look at that as, if it stays and people aren't having to guess if it's going to go away, it's going to be really change the face of acute care telemedicine specifically, where you can do things at a reduced cost as a hospital while also trying to leverage and maximize your best clinicians across more than one site. Everywhere you have to think about windshield time, hallway time, drive time. All that is time that you could be spending with a patient. In fact, most physicians would prefer to be spending that time with a patient versus, running out of their house at 2 a.m. to the hospital or running down the hallway between floors. And I think that's where telemedicine can really take off.
Yeah, I think, like you, I'm excited by everything that's happened. And in many ways, it gave people the excuse to do it, right? Like they wanted to do it. They knew it was the right thing to do it, but they just could never get the justification or the budget or whatever it was. So I think there's some exciting stuff ahead. What's next for SOC Telemed? What are you looking forward to? What are you working on?
You can imagine the team's working on a lot. We spend as much time taking questions and answering questions about acute care telemedicine right now as we're working on growing the business in more general terms. We have some great physicians on the staff that talk more outwardly at conferences and asking questions. We have a number of folks I mentioned from a Six Sigma standpoint that are talking to physician groups and talking to others about how to think through telemedicine strategies, because that element of you can watch a lot of videos, you can really try to get into it. Time matters. All the little details really do matter. And the fact that we've been in this game for 16 years, we've learned a lot of those pieces. And I think those lessons can come forward. I think we look at this as a space with all kinds of opportunity. We started 16 years ago as a neurology company and then grew into other specialties. And then 6 years ago, we built our Telemed IQ platform that's now used for 16 specialties in the acute care space. And I think that's just the beginning. I think the element of trying to connect the right specialist at the right time to the right patient and helping ease the burden of the lack of specialists across the country, the mission is incredible. And I know my whole team gets behind that. It's the first thing I felt when I came to SOC. You could feel that there's a tangible mission where you just know you're making a difference. And I think everyone that's in healthcare that wants to make a difference will feel that. And I think the future is got all kinds of opportunity to it.
Yeah. I have to admit, every time you talk about the speed of what's needed, I've heard enough of the the amazing stories of the importance of speed, especially with various conditions, that gives me chills just thinking about, honestly, the impact that it could have and how important that is for a patient. So thanks so much, John. I appreciate you sharing these insights and perspectives, helping us learn more about, I think something that's not talked about enough. So, that's on me too. I'll take that one on my shoulders, the acute care telehealth space, and also learning more about SOC Telemed. And thanks everyone for watching. If you want to find more great health IT content like this, be sure to check it out at healthcareittoday.com. Thanks, John.
Thank you.